Evo, predlažem da počnemo. Uvaženi ministre,
I propose that we start. Dear Ombudsman, Your Excellency Popa, Ms. Giacomopoulou, ladies and gentlemen, good day to you all and welcome to the National Conference regarding observance of human rights during the COVID-19 pandemic, organized with our traditional partners, EU delegation to Montenegro, the Council of Europe, and the institution of the Protector of Human Rights and Freedoms of Montenegro, the Ombudsman of Montenegro, in cooperation with the Fund for Democracy and the Norwegian Embassy. It's organized at with the aim to mark the Human Rights Day, the day when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948, and for the first time in humanity, right was recognized to all people, to life, freedom and security without differences. She's reading very fast. This is also the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the law in Montenegro, so this is a very important topic, and I invite Mr. Leposevic, Minister of Justice and Human and Minority Rights, to take the floor.
Oh, you have translation? Yes. So, okay. Dakle, htio bih...
So, first of all, I wish to thank you for the invitation. It's truly a pleasure in the beginning of the mandate and the duty or the operations of the new government. It is truly an honor for me to be here to mark the Human Rights Day together with the Excellencies, ambassadors, representatives of the EU and the Council of Europe in Montenegro, as well as with the Ombudsman's office, our Ombudsman, and our host, representative of the non-governmental sector. I wish to congratulate you for organizing this conference. When we speak about human rights, it is customary to see that topic as a topic that's completely separate from the rest of the human rights, or human rights as part of the law are seen as just one area of law. However, the essence is, the truth is that human rights is a whole legal system. That is, the whole legal system exists for the sake of the human rights. Substantive law in both private and public law exists in order to protect and provide guarantees and define the different conditions and manners for the achievement of the specific human rights, the exercise of those rights. On the other hand, procedural law, such as the Criminal Procedure Code or Civil Procedure or the law, the overall legal system exists with the aim to stipulate who can do what and what they can do, what they're authorized to do, or it prescribes the manner and procedure for exercise of all the rights. All of this is aimed at actually to support human rights. So human rights as such exist in all branches of law, in family law, rights of children in particular, and then property-related rights, then in the criminal law, the penal law in general, again, exists even when it is focused on punishing the perpetrators of criminal offenses. It exists in order to protect all the others, or better say, the criminal law exists for the protection of the society, and to that end the criminal offenses are divided into chapters that are called criminal offenses against honor and reputation and so on. These are all the basic fundamental values of the society, and we try to protect them through law. So it's important to understand that human rights are not just one branch of law, and to that end to say that in criminal law term or civil law terms, that these are separated systems. No, all of the systemic laws that exist, as systemic laws, they apply as legal standards for decades and hundreds of years, all with the aim to protect the human rights. So human rights are an inherent, natural, fundamental part of the legal system. That's on one hand. On the other hand, of course, particular attention is paid to the human rights or understanding of the need to protect human rights in the countries of the former communist bloc or the post-communist tradition. This was the case with us in Montenegro. We no longer are. And to that end, because of the experience with the one-party system or a communist state that limited significantly either excluding certain rights or limiting the scope of exercise of the rights that were recognized, we are in a situation to try to now keep pace with the modern developed democracies that also have issues, of course, that have a strong need for things to be done. When we look at the issue of human rights and COVID-19 today, I think we're all struggling with the same problems on how to ensure protection of health and lives of the people on the one hand, and on the other, not to exceed with the or go too far with the limitation of human rights. To that end, I don't know if I should give my presentation in full right now. I should, okay. I believe that later on we'll have time to ask questions. In Montenegro, we have a relatively good legal framework, and part of that work has been successfully done. Naturally, when this is not sufficient per se, we have other laws. When the previous government is in question, we should praise their work on legislation when it comes to anti-discrimination laws or the provisions that refer to anti-discrimination contained in other laws. But I think there is a lot of room for useful amendments to the existing legislation as well that would provide additional legal certainty and expand the scope of human rights. What I wish to emphasize is that we will have to ensure better, more consistent implementation. Of course, it can never be perfect. It's in human nature, in the nature of big organizations, political parties, and public authorities. So it's impossible to achieve it in full. However, this is not so important. The goal is to go in the right direction, to correct the mistakes made in the past, and to ensure consistent implementation of the existing rights, so that all people feel that they have legal certainty and that they know that their rights will be protected. Of course, this task is related. Once the legislator does his or her part of the work, it remains the duty of all the authorities and state institutions and other actors such as NGOs and educational institutions. It's our common task, with our own example, through joint actions, through solidarity, not only as organizations dealing with the protection of human rights, to develop the climate of solidarity and understanding so that the rights of all belong to all and should be exercised in that way. This is a task before us, and the ministry that I manage will give its full contribution. I remain open, of course, will try to be even more involved and contribute to the extent possible to open our ministry to the public. And once again, what's ultimately important to understand is that the only limitation to the exercise of human rights, but an important one, are the rights of others. Human rights that as such, in my deep belief, are not absolute, are not unlimited, but the right of others is a border. Ultimately, this is a constitutional right. So we can always have a good orientation when we're exercising our rights and fighting for the rights of others. We need to know it describes the essence of the human rights, so they will not become, a way to bother others, but to ensure rights of the people without, let's say, violating the rights of others, because rights of others are complementary to the rights that we have. And as a legal system, we are trying to strike a proper balance in that respect, ensuring that individuals exercise that right, their rights, but without violating rights of others. That will be all on my side. Thank you, Mr. Lepovsevich, for emphasizing the importance of human rights, but the fact that their limitation is not necessarily a violation. So this is a focus exactly of our meeting today, and invite now Ms. Popa to take the floor.
Ombudsman Bekovic, Ms. Giacomopoulou, Mr. Radovic, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about this vital issue of human rights in times when the resurgence of the COVID-19 pandemic is putting our health and livelihood at risk and our core values to the test. This virus obviously generates great suffering to many individual families, while also severely affecting social and economic development. Another perhaps less obvious, but equally detrimental impact of the COVID-19 crisis is that it amplifies inequalities and deeply challenges social cohesion and tolerance. Montenegro is by no means immune to those risks. Vulnerable groups in Montenegro have been hit harder than others. The COVID-19 crisis has impacted, in particular, the rights and welfare of Montenegrin women and children, victims of an alarming increase of violence and discrimination in period of lockdowns. We have also seen worrying cases of violations of human rights relating to personal data protection, private life, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of movement in the country. Finally, the crisis has exposed weaknesses in the functioning and delivery of public services, such as health, education, employment, and justice. Those are bitter lessons of the COVID-19 crisis that suggest that human rights should be placed in the center of the measures taken to tackle the pandemic. Some emergency and sanitary measures will clearly limit our fundamental rights, but it is vital that any such restrictions are lawful and necessary. And by all means, I encourage categorically people to respect those measures and to show individual responsibility. But any restrictions on freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly and freedom of movement need to be considered with great care. Also, when designing and implementing strategies and measures to tackle the pandemic, there must be no discrimination and no one should be left behind. As you have seen, the virus does not discriminate, and neither should we when it comes to protecting our citizens. The individuals who were exposed to the risk of poverty, discrimination, or violence before the pandemic are even more so exposed now. That is why we need solidarity, support, and protection of the society, now more than ever. In those difficult times, the EU stands ready to support the relevant social and political stakeholders in Montenegro to play their part in promoting, advancing, and acting to protect fundamental rights and freedoms. With this in mind, I wish you a fruitful discussion at today's conference. Hvala vam.
Zahvaljujem, gospođo Popa, naročito na isticanju slučajeva koji su obilježili ovu godinu.
Thank you, Ms. Popper, particularly for mentioning the cases of violation of human rights this year related to the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and so on. I hope this will not happen in the future. And now I invite Mr. Bjekovic to take the floor. Ambassador Popper, Madam Giacomopoulou, Mr. Leposavic, Minister Leposavic, it's an honor and a pleasure for me today to emphasize another important fact. This is the birthday of the institution of Ombudsman in Montenegro, which was established 17 years ago. Maybe not too much time, maybe a lot of time. I don't know if it's the proper moment to summarize the work of this institution. I know that I can recall you of several important things when it comes to the system of human rights in the past. As you probably know, I start from an important presumption that positions the institution of the Ombudsman in the existing constitution in the part that is not related to the structure of public authorities. I think that the Constitution thus puts Ombudsman into the position of the so-called fourth branch of power. This increases the importance of the Ombudsman's or the relevance of the Ombudsman's office and our duty to openly speak about human rights and to ensure their proper implementation. What's also important for the period behind us, but also for the period to come, is to remind you of the four key principles that the system of human rights and freedoms is based upon. That's their universal character, inseparability, mutual independence, and connection. And this is all with a good reason. Exactly because of that, I wish to add that our task is not only to look into the system of human rights, as Mr. Leposavic said, from the aspect of whether we have quality laws or we don't. I think that the time to come is yet to show whether we have good laws. The Ombudsman's office never hid its position that the system of human rights and freedoms in Montenegro in terms of law requires significant amendments in terms of terminology used, but also certain provisions, substantive provisions. As a small state, we have a lot of laws. In those laws, and time behind us show that, we have very serious dilemmas when it comes to the terminology used, from the aspect of the contents of the human rights, not so much with respect to their recognition, but rather when we speak about their limitation. And that's the essence of the story when we speak about human rights. So people are usually not so interested in knowing all those rights because they believe that they are granted all the rights that belong to civilized men today. But what raise many issues are the limitations that as such exist, and I'd say that the time we live in has simply imposed the need to talk about limitation of human rights and freedoms because the pandemic itself has caused those limitations to be introduced as such. But the position of Montenegro when it comes to human rights and freedoms and their application is additionally burdened, I'd say, or additionally more complex due to the fact that we have different legal systems where we have coexistence of rights and freedoms, but more or less all of those laws are complementary. That is, they complement each other, and in such circumstances, both institutionally, I'd also say from the point of view of practice, we have to implement all the standards of human rights and freedoms, including the ones related to limitations. In order not to cause additional discussion, we have quite a bit of it in Montenegro anyhow, I'd mention human rights and freedoms that exist in the legal order of the EU, because with the signing of the SAPC, we have clearly stated that we wish to harmonize our legislation in the first 5 years with 4 greatest freedoms, and after that with the overall acquis communautaire. And to that end, the Ombudsman's office had a key role to play, and I think my assessment is that we've done that well, exactly using the standards in line with the EU law to come up with the proper limitations with the aim to achieve full protection of human rights and freedoms. I think I have corrected these introductory remarks now in the very beginning, so I would just like to tackle now what it is that burdens the system of human rights and freedoms in Montenegro today, and did so in the past as well. The causes of the existing situation, to some extent, have made the risk for human rights and freedoms to be, not to say equally, but let's say noted also in other countries, bigger ones and more developed than Montenegro. In the discussions I had, I tried to understand the key arguments why we had violation of human rights and freedoms, or a risk that was posed to them. So we thought this was part of the, it was partially due to the big migrations happening in the region and from farther regions, and the economic crisis that exists for quite a while now. And the third important aspect is this pandemic, which, if we even thought for a second, was somehow slowing down, it seems that is actually increasing as a threat, not only this year, at the end of the year, but also in the year to come. The Ombudsman's Office has registered in the previous year, I'd say, the highest number of individual complaints in this year since the office was established. I guess partially it's due to the increase in the level of trust of the public in the Ombudsman's Office. This is quite obvious from the press clippings, but maybe it's also because we have increased violations of human rights and freedom. So these are two aspects of it that we have to analyze. One thing, the thing we've registered is the violations of the subtle part of those rights, such as privacy, violations related to the right of assembly and freedom of expression. And we did have in the previous period cases that require questioning the work and also future actions of all state authorities. So I fully agree with what the minister said, that understanding the current situation and the concept of human rights is part of the responsibility undertaken by any responsible government if it wants to meet the basic principles of human rights. So the statistics show, and this is yet another relatively new indicator, that when it comes to the activities of the Ombudsman's Office, that we have heterogeneous areas where the complaints come from. So practically, in this period so far, we've had almost an equal number of cases when it comes to protection against discrimination, protection of human rights from violations committed by the state authorities and other institutions that exercise public duties, when it comes to torture or rights of persons deprived of liberty or whose movement is limited, and the rights of children. Now, why is this happening? Why we have this distribution of burden when it comes to the functioning of the institution and such heterogeneous areas when it comes to violations of human rights and freedoms? That's difficult to explain at this point. It requires a deep analysis. We can only speak about that once we summarize the work of the Ombudsman's Office in the period to come. What's certain is that we have a need not only to crystallize these standards that refer to our institution directly, but this is something we're emphasizing continuously. You cannot have standards of human rights tackled only by the Ombudsman's Office. We need to have integrated standards of human rights, not distributed to the human rights of the Constitutional Court, of the Ombudsman's Office, of the Ministry of Justice, and so on. The standards are the same. They exist or they don't exist. In these circumstances, I'd say that what is particularly concerning for the Ombudsman's Office and that awaits us apart from the civil rights is the stagnation of human rights when it comes to economic and social rights as a consequence of all those factors that have somehow come out of the pandemic itself. So We speak about economic and social problems such as unemployment, that is quite obvious. We speak about particularly vulnerable position of certain groups. We've mentioned here that some of the particularly vulnerable groups, we have those of low income, unemployed persons, households of the elderly, particularly in the rural areas, but also persons with disability. And then we also have representatives of the LGBTIQ population inherited from before the pandemic, I'd say, and also very vulnerable position of women, particularly women who have recently had babies. And I'd add there another category, and I hope we'll have the support of the ministry in this. We've sent this initiative to them. That's victims of domestic violence. Montenegro is noting continuously, I'd say, not only this year, there is an increase in the number of cases before the misdemeanor courts. We have to look into the criminal law aspect also, but I think we note continuously an increase in the number of cases of domestic violence, and this should result in certain action. All of the measures taken so far, including education, introduction of protective measures, and some other mechanisms to act in a preventive manner, so far, if we look into the statistics, have not given adequate results. In order not to make it also pessimistic on this important day, what I wish to say as an encouragement, and it was mentioned already, we need to entertain the overall society to understand that the human rights are not an issue of compromise. They are not an issue of someone's will. They are already granted as such. They are guaranteed to each and every person from the day they're born. And to go back to the topic that was again mentioned here in the time before us, we'll need to show much greater level of social solidarity. That would mean engagement of all economic, political, social, and civil society actors to understand the position we're in and to understand what is the way in which we need to approach the issues for the system of human rights and freedoms to at least remain at the same level, not to be derogated due to the pandemic and its effects. But I think at this point where ultimately we're marking this special day dedicated to human rights, now, in those conditions, we can't even assume what the tasks are before us. That's why it's important to talk about human rights, to always have them in our focus, and where necessary, where there are requests submitted, take more concrete action. I hope I didn't take too much of your time. I just wanted to cover the areas that we work on. Thank you, Mr. Biekovic. I'm pleased to hear that you've mentioned the 4 basic principles of human rights. This is something we should have in our minds at all times, and particularly now, we should not allow the pandemic to be a justified reason to violate them. Thank you again. And now I invite Ms. Giacomopoulou, head of the Program Office of the Council of Europe in Podgorica, to take the floor.
Thank you. Minister Leposevic, Your Excellency, Ambassador Popa, dear Ombudsman, dear Mr. Radovic, dear attendees in the room or following us online. Allow me first to say that it's an honor to celebrate today this anniversary of the Ombudsman's Office in this excellent company, in addition to the International Day of Human Rights, and also when it comes to the Council of Europe. This year is our anniversary of the 70th year of the European Convention of Human Rights. So a lot of grounds for celebration, for positive celebration, despite naturally the pandemic, which I will get to in a minute. But just to put it in a context, the Council of Europe was established to rebuild lasting peace in Europe after World War II, and it has largely succeeded by establishing standards and mechanisms ensuring the protection of human rights, rule of law, and democratic values through its member states. Our values and our ability to uphold them are, however, put to the test by the unprecedented challenges our societies face today due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to borrow the word of our Secretary General here, who said that in these challenging times, when governments are forced to take exceptional measures to protect their people, human rights may sometimes be seen as dispensable luxury, at least temporarily. However, the opposite is true, and it is in these hard times that we most depend on our core values to guide us. It is recognized at the outset that governments are facing formidable challenges in seeking to protect their populations from the threat of COVID-19. It is also understood that exceptional measures are required to combat the virus, namely the confinement, and it is accepted that the measures undertaken will inevitably encroach on human rights and freedoms, which are an integral and necessary part of a democratic society governed by rule of law. The major social, political, and legal challenge facing our member states will be their ability to respond to this crisis effectively, while at the same time ensuring that the measures they take do not undermine human rights. One word perhaps about rule of law before digging more into human rights. What should be borne in mind first and foremost is that even in an emergency situation, the rule of law must prevail, which means that states, even in a state of emergency, the latter should be limited in its duration, in its scope, and respect the principle of necessity. While the executive authorities should be able to act quickly and efficiently, parliaments must keep the power to control executive action, and the core function of the judiciary, in particular the constitutional courts, should be maintained. Looking at human rights more specifically, a lot has already been raised, but allow me certain remarks. First of all, when adopting measures, authorities should always bear in mind that certain convention rights do not allow for any derogation. To be very clear, allow me to cite them. That is the right to life, the prohibition of torture and inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, the prohibition of slavery and servitude, and the rule of no punishment without law. There can be no derogation from abolishment of death penalty or the right not to be tried or punished twice. Where derogations are possible, under Article 15 of our Convention, they must have a clear basis in domestic law in order to protect against arbitrariness and be strictly necessary to fighting against the public emergency. States should always seek to protect the democratic order that from the threats that it is facing. And every effort should be made to safeguard the values of a democratic society, such as pluralism, tolerance, and broad-mindedness. While derogations have been accepted by the court to justify some exceptions to the Convention standards, they can never justify any action that goes against the paramount Convention requirements of lawfulness and proportionality. Looking at certain rights in particular, where derogations could be required. For example, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of association, right to private life, Articles 8, 9, 10, 11. Even where those are permissible, they have to be established by law and proportionate to the legitimate aim pursued, including that, of course, can be protection of health, as is the case right now. Another aspect that I would like to touch upon today, and has already been brought up, is of course the protection of the vulnerable groups or most marginalized parts of the population, in particular against discrimination and hate crime, hate speech. The principle of non-discrimination is of utmost importance in this particular context. The measures taken should not discriminate unjustifiably between different categories of persons. Certain forms of discrimination can in fact amount to degrading treatment prohibited by Article 3, which is non-derogable provision. Moreover, the fact of not taking into account the specific needs of persons belonging to a disadvantaged group may result in discrimination, which means that in addition to to refraining from taking measures that may result in discrimination, member states have a positive obligation to take positive measures to achieve substantive equality. History has shown that in times of crisis, minority communities are often turned into scapegoats and are subjected to racist, exclusionary, and often violent discourses and practices. This was indeed confirmed by the COVID-19 pandemic across Europe, across the world, and also in Montenegro. Persons belonging to national minorities, migrants, or LGBTI communities have been reported to be exposed to stigma, linking the virus to their perceived or real belonging to their community. At a more structural level, the crisis has also magnified both society's weaknesses and their strengths in creating conditions for equality and inclusion for all and enhancing diverse societies' resilience to such crises. I think what is especially relevant in Montenegro is to raise the fact that we have observed, like in many other countries, a rise in certain similar sentiments. Anti-Roma sentiments have been frequently mentioned. For a number of persons belonging to the LGBTI community, especially young persons, compliance with lockdown regulations has meant returning home and potentially being confined in a hostile environment with family members who are unsupportive or do not accept their gender identity or sexual orientation. Beyond discrimination, we need to bear in mind its more severe form in terms of crime and ensure protection of victims of crime. Incidents are increasingly reported, showing that the policy of isolation and confinement leads to increased levels of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and therefore to a heightened need for protection against this. A particular group that is at heightened risk under the pandemic are, for example, victims of human trafficking that can find themselves in an even more vulnerable position as a result of limited capacities of law enforcement and services to support them and, or for accessing shelters. We can also discuss the fact that in our modern society and the rise of our increased, rather, use of information and communication technologies, well, this has also facilitated at the same time the work and activities of organized criminal groups. To conclude for now, I would like to say that even after the acute phase of the crisis, our societies will have to find the means to repair the social and economic damage and further enhance trust in our democratic institutions. Among other things, a broad reflection will need to be initiated on the protection of the most vulnerable individuals and groups and the means to safeguard their rights in a more sustainable and solidary governance model. On this unique occasion, on behalf of the Council of Europe Program Office in Podgorica, I would like to reiterate our commitment to support the Montenegrin authorities jointly with the European Union and through cooperation with our national and international partners in reinforcing democratic processes and the rule of law in the country, and in ensuring that the right balance is found to contain the pandemic, protect the health of the Montenegrin people, while ensuring respect and access to their human rights. Thank you.
Zahvaljujem gospođo Giacomo-Poulovu, naročito na ukazivanju standarda na koje ne smijemo zaboraviti u ovim vremenima kada su kako emocije.
Thank you. At these times, the emotions and fears are emphasized. I'm glad that you mentioned minorities and migrants who are really rarely mentioned by NGOs and other institutions at the time of pandemic. Now I'll give the floor to Mr. Radović, Program Director of the Civic Alliance. You have the floor, Mr. Radović. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Alexandra. At the very beginning, allow me to greet all the speakers and all our friends with whom we've been organizing celebrations of the International Human Rights Day for years now. Every year we're trying to raise a new issue, a new area we believe deserves further improvements in the sphere of legislation and practice of institutions. At the very beginning, I would also like to congratulate this day to all citizens of Montenegro. I will also say that this year, as you all know, we're celebrating this day in very specific circumstances. This entire Human Rights Week actually is taking place in very specific circumstances, and I'm really sorry that all those who we believed were supposed to be here are not with us. However, we did make sure that this conference can be seen on the social media in live feed. As I said, this year has seen a very specific situation. I believe that the previous speakers already said how important this situation is and how important it is for us to improve the legislation and implementation of legislation. But I would add one more thing. We also need to improve the capabilities, the capacity of our institutions and their willingness, their sensitivity to human rights and respect for human rights in this actually a lot different situation than the last year. We use these lists and the publishing of lists was already mentioned. I can really tell you that when these lists were published, including personal data of citizens who were in self-isolation, did happen. And also we should mention that at one point in time, these lists were made available to the public in different ways. Actually, the data about the citizens who were infected with COVID, and all these things somehow amounted to some sort of a scandal, not just in many discussions that took place here in Montenegro, but also in the region, I'd say, and even broader. Even this story even reached the UN, and these examples were examples of gross violation of human rights. If we have in mind that the data about health condition of citizens are particularly protected personal data. So in this context, we, as an organization that filed an initiative for assessment of constitutionality of such decision, it is our role to say that the response of the Constitutional Court, although it was positive, was not efficient, and we are really not pleased with it, and we can conclude that the Constitutional Court failed to act upon our initiative faster, especially if we take into account that we asked for the Constitutional Court to suspend the publishing of such lists until they reach a decision, but that did not happen. And when the Constitutional Court rendered its decision, it was completely irrelevant, because that's when the government and relevant institutions stopped publishing such lists themselves. Apart from the inactivity or slow response of the Constitutional Court in this specific case, we who are dealing with citizens on a daily basis, who are working with them, it was our expectation from the Constitutional Court, and it was the citizens' expectation actually, that the Constitutional, we all expected the Constitutional Court to be a correctional factor, and we did not expect them to wait for so long. We wanted them to be more proactive in response to many problems we all saw. Apart from the Constitutional Court, I would also like to underline the role of the Parliament of Montenegro, which also was not there, was not played well. It's especially important for the Parliament to exercise its control function during the crisis, taking into account that the state of emergency was not declared, and that many decisions should have been checked by the Parliament. One more thing that I would like briefly touch upon is the actions of state institutions. Well, the fact that the state institutions were selective in their work, in a sense that these measures applied to regular citizens, and the compliance with measures was checked all the time. Well, on the other hand, politicians and officials, when they did not comply with the measures, there was no adequate judicial response. Because of that, the citizens simply lost trust in the public system, in judiciary, in the legal certainty. So we all saw the situations where citizens were deprived of liberty because they were outside in front of their building or house during the curfew, while on the other hand, many politicians were forgiven for much more serious offenses, for instance, attending massive gatherings without protective equipment or even unauthorized events. One more thing I'd like to mention. There's a whole list of citizens that are waiting for the situation in which they will be better able to exercise their rights, and I apologize, I won't be able to mention them all, but I would underline, I would point out to certain groups which, according to the Ombudsman and international organization reports, are the groups that are facing discrimination and violation of human rights the most. I would use the opportunity to mention these groups. First of all, I'd like to mention the persons with disabilities. So these circumstances that are caused by the crisis and the fight against this virus are also exacerbating their status and position additionally. And every year, speakers who give speeches when celebrating the International Human Rights Day and other activists, we always raise this issue. We talk about the need to improve this situation, but I am personally not satisfied with how the institutions follow and act upon all these activities I believe it's high time we implemented efficient measures so that our citizens belonging to the group of persons with disabilities can start exercising their rights better right away, because they are at the margins. They're excluded from all activities in the field of education, employment, and etc. I would also use the opportunity to bring to your attention another phenomenon that we've been monitoring for a while, and we've been providing legal aid in this area. That's the phenomenon of selective implementation of legislation by state institutions. I primarily refer to prosecution offices and courts. And with respect to victims of torture, we now all witness that plea agreements are entered into with police officers who admit to torturing someone, and that has been done in several cases, and that's absolutely unacceptable. Also, there is this practice where when citizens are complaining against police officers and police officers are complaining about citizens, and state institutions resolve the complaints, the cases, when state institutions file such complaints, they are resolved faster. I'm glad to have our Minister of Justice here with us. This area requires urgent measures and urgent re-examination of the practice and urgent response so that citizens are protected. Let me remind you of numerous reports, more specifically the CPT report, which states that citizens are not yet protected by police officers, and torture and ill treatment can still happen here. and are still possible. I would also mention the victims of war crimes in Montenegro, yet another area in which we have to invest additional effort. We have to do something to finally start coping with the past, because the process we've had so far, we can call it the process of forgetting war from the past, and many victims, many cases which are yet to see justice, which are yet to see that those who perpetrated such crimes are prosecuted. Well, unfortunately, so far only the lowest ranking members of various groups were subject to criminal proceedings and were trialed. And I believe that finally, after 3 decades, we really have to change this practice, and we have to make state institutions efficiently handle war crime cases in Montenegro, and also cases that Montenegro is responsible for. And let me conclude with the asylum seekers and migrants. Despite the fact that I believe we have a stable system for asylum seekers and the procedure that should be followed in that respect, unfortunately in practice and after our work in the sphere of legal aid, I believe that these procedures have to be made more efficient. What also has to be done is ensure that communication between state institutions which are in charge of the integration process of those persons who were granted asylum in Montenegro is much more efficient, because we are all witnesses of state institutions who are yet to become fully knowledgeable of all the relevant standards. They don't still cooperate fully, and the citizens who have the right to education and employment are still facing a lot of problems. Let me finish by calling upon the citizens, by telling them that they should continue fighting for their human rights. I believe this is something that in the past, well, it was, whenever we would talk about human rights, this was quite positive, something positive that we would notice, because we really had active citizens who approached institutions, NGOs, the media. I believe that is the best way for us to reach that level that we can be satisfied with. Thank you once again. I, of course, remain at your disposal for any questions. Thank you, Mr. Radovic, for this comprehensive overview of the human rights situation in Montenegro that the Civic Alliance has been pointing out to since the beginning of pandemic. Ms. Popa has a very important meeting she has to attend. She has to leave early, but before that, Minister Leposevic. Yes, I wanted to take the floor. I asked the ambassador if she could just spend with us another minute or two, because of one very important thing I would like to share with you. So first of all, with respect to what Mr. Radovic said, underlining these vulnerable groups, of course, these, well, we can look at statistics and we can identify that certain of these certain groups, vulnerable groups, require our urgent response and help. When Mr. Radovic mentioned the victims of torture and war crimes, I must say that I fully agree with him. We have to commit to resolving all these cases of gross violation of human rights. And thirdly, when it comes to protection of persons with disabilities, this is going to be a part of the program of the new government very soon to be adopted, and it's going also to be a part of our plan of the ministry. We will try to improve the situation, to enhance and stimulate further existing processes and to introduce new ones. We are going to pay special attention to protection of the disabled. In our ministry, we are going to form a special directorate which will be dealing with protection of persons with disabilities. This directorate will first of all, be overseeing the situation on the field. They'll do the screening, and they will then, on the basis of their findings, suggest new policies and strategies. Also, with respect to what Mr. Bjekovic said, given that we are celebrating the International Human Rights Day, I will use the opportunity here in front of the media representatives and human rights experts and our hosts in sense of European integration and our membership in the the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. This is an extremely important, perhaps one of the most important human rights bodies in the history of the world. Also in the presence of Ambassador Poppa, given this tremendously important role of continuous political dialogue and initiatives, of course, implemented in Montenegro by the EU. I believe we should not forget what the commitments and standards in this area are of Montenegro. So in front of all of you, I'd like to announce that our plan is the following. Our ministry offers the Ombudsman to enter into a cooperation agreement, and Mr. Bjekovic can tell us whether they agree. The three key points of this agreement would be intersectoral cooperation, of course. So, in other words, to institutionalize our cooperation by exchanging data. I learned that Mr. Bjekovic has a team of excellent associates, co-workers who are very diligent and hardworking. So I believe we should share data so that we can create certain joint policies by the Ministry of Justice and on the Ombudsman's office. And finally, under this agreement, the Ombudsman should be involved in the legislative process from the very beginning. Whenever there are there's legislative drafting efforts, they should be involved. You know how important that is at the beginning when you're shaping a law and you have to see how it affects people. You know how we always do regulatory impact assessments, environmental impact assessment. In this context, we should, on the technical side, we have the Secretariat for Legislation, but in addition to this, I would really like personally to involve the Ombudsman in legislative drafting process. So this kind of agreement would be something we are very much inclined to, and I believe that this agreement would be helpful in many different segments. You from the NGO sector are here, and you can also, I believe you would be happy with it. All you need to do now is say whether you agree or not. Mr. Bjekovic? Well, before that, let me thank Ambassador Poppa for joining us today, for giving her contribution. Thank you so much.
Dajem riječ gospodinu Bjekoviću ukoliko...
So, Mr. Bjekovic, you have the floor, if you wish, of course. Well, as for the institution of the Ombudsman, there is not a single reason for which this open offer, let me put it that way, should be rejected. The only thing we need to do is to look at technical details to see whether the Ombudsman institution can enter into such agreements. What's extremely important is the fact that no paper will prevent us from being there for you, for helping you anyway, or wherever you believe our institution should be. We only had a bit of a reserve in this sense because we had two different interpretations of international expert recommendations. Some said that we should not be interfering in the work of authorities, work of working groups, drafting legislation. However, we said whoever invites us to be a part of this process will have someone from our institution in the capacity of observer or anything else. you did something that many predecessors neglected so far. So each time there's a piece of legislation being drafted, gender sensitivity, gender considerations should be taken into account. Then special categories also considerations should be taken into account. And what you just mentioned, what you suggested now, this agreement is an excellent form of cooperation, because we are not only the controllers of state institutions, it is in our best interest to any potential violation, human rights violation, are eliminated even before they occur. So there's one thing that I can guarantee. I have to, of course, it's a protocol. I have to first introduce myself and meet the new public officials. Mr. Krivokapic, I already know. We already worked together some time in past. And with you and with all other executive branch representatives, I am in contact on a daily basis. It's something we do. My phone numbers are there, published, available to anyone. So whenever you need my assistance, our assistance, opinion, suggestion, you can approach us. And of course, when it comes to special vulnerable groups, of course, there's so much to talk about, and I look forward to our cooperation, especially because one part of my colleagues is not here with us physically. They are listening to this on the platform, and they are already familiar with it. So one of the key reasons for such eagerness that we have to work with us is that so far we have hardly ever had a chance to meet members of the executive power in our institution. Apart from that, our everyday work is based on the fact, and as Ms. Giacomopoulou said, on the following: there's not a single opinion or activity of our institution that was not documented or supported by the European Court of Human Rights or some other body of the Council of Europe or bodies of the European Union. I can also assure the Montenegrin public, as I'm a member of the European Commission Against Racism and Tolerance for many years now, but I would not reveal how many years, because that would say a lot about my age. Trust me, you are more than welcome to cooperate with us also within the framework of the reports of this commission. All these experiences can be useful for all of us, and we can also help you find new collaborators. And none of the aspects, well, of course, we remain at your disposal, and we will be here to provide support, just as we have been providing it to also NGOs, and Civic Alliance is one of them, of course. Thank you, Mr. Biekovic. Now it's time for discussion, and journalists will also have the chance to ask questions. If you don't have any questions, we have a question that we got on the social media. It's not for anyone in particular. I'll just read the question, and whoever wishes to answer may take the floor. During the pandemic, military forces were used, and that's not in line with the legislation. Previously, we had deployment of special anti-terrorist unit in the public assemblies, which is also contrary to the laws. What is your position on this? So not for anyone in particular, just whoever wishes to take the floor. So the deployment of a military. Well, I will try to avoid this risk of talking about something which does not fall within our scope of authority, but as far as I know, the military has very restricted powers, actually, or can be used only in certain situations. And now that we're talking about our experiences and the support of the armed forces of Montenegro in a sense of the functioning of the quarantine back in the day, I believe Montenegrin citizens had quite positive impressions about military members in this specific for this specific purpose. When other elements, other segments are concerned, our institution has issued releases many times, and both and military members, the soldiers, are also citizens of this country, and they also have rights and responsibilities. And only when these rights provided for by relevant national and international legislations are violated, only then we can talk about certain illegitimate situations. And I wouldn't really have anything else to say in this respect. We have now two comments. They both are concerned with human rights. Each worker has to be registered with health insurance right after the 15-day trial period. That's the only way to fight the grey economy. Let me try to explain. Our institution has been quite active in the sphere of grey or undeclared work, especially because these persons were not able to exercise all the rights that other employed persons have. Fight against grey economy generally in the labor market is possible only if different state institutions take synchronized action. In these circumstances, it's really, we can't really imagine that any of these institutions can be excluded from this process. You know that the labor inspection is in charge of combating grey economy, actually undeclared labor situations. In addition to that, of course, all other state institutions have to be involved. From the aspect of our institution, I can tell you that we in this country, people have mastered the skill of avoiding to comply with legislation. So when these situations, however, involve violations of the law, it's non-negotiable. The violations have to be sanctioned. If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and I would like to close the conference. Thank you so much.